Ron Eichmann, everyone. Big round of applause. A huge, I've got two microphones, a huge pleasure to introduce Eimar Walshe, pronouns they, them. Eimar Walshe is an artist and writer working between Ireland and their new home, the Netherlands. They are two-time research fellows at the VAM with the endeavour to extend academic study in queer theory and feminist epistemology to the production of sculpture, publishing, performances, lectures and country music. Eimar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. It's very exciting to hear that my new home is in the Netherlands. Sounds like an offer of a house or something. Can I? Was that? Okay, thanks. So this is a brief introduction to a project that I worked on with the vanabbemuseum and the Design Academy in Eindhoven, called the Department of Sexual Revolution Studies. This is a learning platform between the institutions invested in critical inquiry on the subject of sexual revolution in art, design and visual culture. It took the form of 5 weekly sessions taken by 11 second-year design students as an elective, but also open across departments to all design students and to the public. So these are the thematics designed by Emma Conway. These are the 4 sessions that I'll come back to and go through in more detail. I've included, this is illustrations from my previous year participating in this. This is my 2nd year participating in this program. Last year I worked on a reading group called, a project called Examining Separatist Epistemologies. So that means I can report on the strong hunch that our curator and program initiator of deviant practice, Nick, is really onto something. Bringing together these papers today is only one visible part of the effects of the research programme. The sustained contact with the institution and the research space, and also the opportunity to live together with other residents in the residency, breeds new perspectives and inspiration. This cohabitation of methodologies and indeed agendas across disciplines is, in my experience, all too rare in institutional space. So for this and for facilitating me in making this project, thank you to Nick, Annie, Charles, Ule, Robert, and all of the attendees of the project. Thanks also to Ron for videoing and to Nick for working on the documentation, some of which you'll see here. As I said, Emma Conway is the designer responsible for the logo and design work. And finally, I have to acknowledge the Arts Council and Culture Ireland for part funding this project and the performance, which will be presented tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the old building. Okay. So for the background, sex reveals power to me and helps me gain understanding of things that have nothing directly to do with sex. In this way, for me, it is politicizing. I know that people have many different paths into politics, but I set up this series in the hope that my route might be of help or interest to others. Unlike my previous research, which sought to create new knowledge or conversations through thinking in distinction and separation, these sessions depended on creating understandings through comparison and analogy. I've learned that both of these strategies are useful but require care. Making comparisons are not the same thing as making equivalences, and making distinctions are not the same thing as segregating. Both of these strategies have a great potential for creating solidarity and understanding, and another great potential for downplaying and undermining people's experiences, suffering, and struggle. So, I'm going to start with this artwork that's on display in the vanabbemuseum at the minute. I first saw the artwork New Sexual Lifestyles by the Irish artist Jared Byrne in the collection display in the vanabbemuseum at the launch of the previous Deviant Practice Symposium in 2017. It was first presented in Ireland in 2003. It's a multi-channel video installation with segments that loop in a randomized system. The video is a restaging of a conversation, a panel interview that was first published in Playboy magazine in 1973 as an article of the same title, New Sexual Lifestyles, a symposium on emerging behaviour patterns from open marriage to group sex. So instead of making a realistic reenactment of the text. In Byrne's work, the Playboy panel are played by Irish actors, many of whom are recognisable from Irish TV or soap operas. They speak in faltering American accents, their Irishness showing through. So there's three things about this artwork that actually inspired this programme, the Department of Sexual Revolution Studies, and I'm going to fill you in on them first of all. The first, okay, so I'll point it out here, this man here, Al Goldstein. I've just drawn it up in a little bit more detail so you can read it more clearly. This is his little cut quote from the panel. If my wife cheated, I'd kill her. She's part of my property. I mean, I am a sexist. And since I pay the bills, I feel I own her the way I own my car, and I don't lend my car out to people. So this comment and sentiment felt violently familiar, and I wanted to take some time to understand what it was made up of psychologically, which led then to a session that I'll talk about later on about cuckolding. The second and related point was the way in which the conversations from this article and indeed the artwork in some ways didn't come across as dated. Jessica earlier mentioned the demoralization you experience when you realise that the same conversation, petition and debates that are in the present contemporary political and social worlds have been taking place for decades at least. So thinking about sexual revolution requires ways of visualising time and history in multiple ways, certainly not exclusively as a progressive timeline towards sexual enlightenment or falling for narratives of things are improving. In both the Irish and the Dutch context, this is why this project felt urgent for me at this time. Especially, I find glaring concerns come up in relation to the idea of a self-congratulatory, ahistorical form of democratic liberal supremacism, similar to maybe pinkwashing, but which also scapegoats nations with less progressive sexual politics, many of which are in place as a result of settler and religious colonialism. For me, personally, there is also something quite humiliating about viewing this work as an Irish person. It's the realisation that Irish actors in this video work didn't, and still don't, pass as experts of the sexual revolution. In 1973, Playboy magazine was still banned from Ireland, and if you wanted to enact some of these new sexual lifestyles in Ireland, it would be another 19 years before a highly restrictive legislation on contraception was lifted. Or if on the other hand you wanted a divorce in Ireland at the time, you'd be waiting another 23 years. For an abortion, you'd be waiting 45 years. The video work presents these actors attempting to speak the terms of sexual liberation and faltering. There's something painful to their parodic, unconvincing acting, which also citationally is similar to the bad acting of pornography. Inverted commas there, meant. And I imagine that in part, speaking with such sexual frankness causes them to stumble and trip on their words. This made me realise that even in our own cultural imagination, we as Irish have a backwards, unsophisticated fantasy of ourselves. I've got a little video to show now. Sorry.
Did you ever get it right? Ever get it right? Ever get it right on a tractor? No, never got it right. Never got it right. Never got it right on a tractor. Did you ever get a feel? Ever get a feel? Ever get a feel of a fibre? No, I never got a feel. Never got a feel. Never got a feel of a fibre. Did you ever get it up? Ever get it up? Never get it upside down. No, I never got it up. Never got it up. I never got it upside down. Did you ever get it in? Ever get it in? Ever get it inside down? No, I never got it in. Never got it in. Never got it inside down. Did you ever get your hole? Ever get your hole? Ever get your hole weeks wages? No, never got me hole. Never got me hole. Never got me hole weeks wages. Did you ever get it right? Ever get it right?
Oh, I don't know the Dutch for full screen. Ah, sorry. Thanks, Ron. Okay, so Then remembering this song from Richie Kavanagh, who's novelty, working in the genre of novelty, country and Irish, which is quite specific, made me rethink what thinking about sexual revolution could look like. And who can be considered an expert on such issues, right? So, to talk about the structure of what went on. The first week we spoke about new sexual lifestyles, and in each preceding week we took a look at some contemporary sexual practice and a political idea that this sexual practice can throw light on or is linked to. We also looked at a country music song, comment from an epistemic perspective, and also participated in interactive activity that would help us come to some emotional insight, both on the sexual and the political. So in this first week, we tried to take on different ways of visualizing how we visualize time, which is kind of then like a tool that can be used to think about history, progress, cycles, revolution. In the second week, we talked about cuckolding. I'm just going to give you a little wordy introduction to that. The term cook, derived from cuckold, has gained increasing online popularity in recent years, both as a pornography search term and as an alt-right insult used against those who hold socialist, feminist, anti-racist and pro-LGBT sentiments. But cuckolding also has a deep and diverse history in religion, literature and popular culture that predates contemporary fascism. What can we learn from this sexual practice that might help us in confronting the global rise of the right today? So this was a kind of participatory session in which we discussed the dynamics of cuckolding, went through several popular cultural references which contain this as a narrative. The concluding one, and the one that I'm actually not going to go into in too much detail because it will be a large part of the performance that's taking place tomorrow, is the song Jolene by Dolly Parton. So just to go through some of the kind of statistics of it, I mean, yeah, I can do this now. The song Jolene by Dolly Parton contains 31 mentions of Jolene, 7 mentions of the man. There are 8 lines describing Jolene, which are detailed and poetic. There are only 3 describing the man, one of which describes the fact that he talks in his sleep. The highest pitch singing the name My Man is F sharp, and the highest pitch singing Jolene's name is D sharp. So this is my kind of little infographic to describe this song as potentially queer, or at least taking on the subject of cuckolding in a radically different way than the sort of violent, threatening, identity crisis-based reaction to fear of cuckolding. Okay, next one. Domination and submission of the sexual kind can take many forms, as we've seen in the previous... Where are you? I can't find you. As we've seen in the previous talk. For example, physical, psychological, or financial, where agency and consent are central to the sexual exchange, as I was describing. So for example, here I've tried to illustrate somebody who is physically bottoming while psychologically topping from below, with somebody who is traditionally a bottom, but operating as a service top in this instance, right? BDSM definitions in turn provide useful frameworks for looking at the distinctions between, this is my argument, economic, religious and cultural, colonial or imperial, past or present. Because many of the modes of BDSM have relationships with chattel slavery, militarism, corporeal punishment and religious imperialism, I think it's important that they are discussed alongside one another, not in equivalent or comparison, but maybe most valuably because it can help us understand how nations, groups and individuals can occupy both the dominator and dominated role simultaneously. This is very helpful and necessary thinking about Ireland as a colonised nation through settler colonialism while also being an agent of religious imperialism. The principle in thinking that I'm trying to emphasise is that both can be true simultaneously. This is a hard thing, I think, sometimes to always bear in mind. So a way of sort of embodying and assimilating this idea was to make a participatory game, like a role-playing game, for the group, in which everyone was assigned a sexual identity, which incorporated both a bottoming and a topping but in different elements. And the whole system is a loop. So you have to try and find a bottom for your top requirement and a top to service your bottom requirement. And this was like, how long did it take us to complete this? Like maybe 15 minutes?
Yeah, 15, 20.
Yeah. And also you couldn't, so the sticker was on your back, so you had to like discover your sexuality through somebody else. The other idea of switching, as in being able to occupy both dominator and oppressed, and or separately topping or bottoming, and like very, very clearly making the distinction, very, very central distinction in relation to consent in this, obviously, is another idea that we tried to work through, which was what I was calling switch epistemology, which is that in situations where basically that knowledge privilege can come from material violence, and material privilege can be the product of knowledge, or can produce knowledge absence. This is kind of what you're hinting at, or getting towards with talking about like bodies that can't know or don't know in the introduction charts. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the fourth one. Okay, so the fourth one was about sexuality and housing. This is an illustration from Tammy Wynette's I Don't Want to Play House. Does anyone know that song? I'll sing it to you after. But anyway, she's observing from the inside of the window, looking out at her little girl who's refusing to play house with the boy next door because it makes her mommy cry when her mommy plays house, because so she's like not reproducing the parental paradigm of heterosexual monogamous family making, and Tammy Wynette's very upset about this. So laws against so-called lewd acts designed to prevent sex in public leaves sexuality, for the most part, contingent on access to private property. Meanwhile, I'm going to actually just elaborate on that a little bit. This is another exercise that we did from the sessions. Make a note of the feelings you have associated with the following memories, if you have them. The first time you overheard sex, the first time you saw an excessive public display of affection, the first time you were overheard having sex, or being told to get a room. So, people shared their various sort of emotional experiences of this, which obviously I'm not going to redocument here, but to create it into an abstract role-playing game again, we did another version of the previous game, which instead assigned everybody different access to privacy and housing. I would say probably kind of equivalent to social level, where it's like extreme. There was like many people who had very limited access, and then a couple of people who like owned hotels or mansions or had like several spare rooms in their house. And again, they had to sort of like work out, or we all had to work out, like how everybody in the game wants to have sex, and most people don't have access to privacy. So how do we actually work out getting that access collaboratively, or the people who had that access could deny it or barter. Okay, and then the fifth one. So the last one was about it was about monogamy, hookup culture, and like sex as effective labor. I don't know if I actually need to like go into any detail with that slide. Right, let's cover it. Okay. So basically, I think my fascination with, thinking about all three of these things in the context of, the The understanding that sex is a form of effective labour, located within its own economy and inside of a wider neoliberal economy. And the final session looked at hookup as a prevalent practice in a so-called post-monogamous society. My understanding is that hookups and monogamy are kind of two sides of the same coin, but I'm really interested in them as the thing that's kind of produced or presented as its like contemporary progressive alternative, because I don't think it is that. This is another slide for this one. When she says she doesn't want a relationship, she used the word relationship. So does that mean that she does want a relationship? Well, my understanding is that hookups are a sexual practice that relies on a contract of no, my understanding was that hookups are a sexual practice that relies on a contract of non-communication. And then I was challenged by the participants in this. But I was interested, what would it look like to be able to approach this subject with a more deliberately articulated and involved process. So I got the group to make like a 10-step hookup plan for me. Like, what do I need to do? And I said, okay, I'm non-binary, bisexual, in an open relationship. I can't host, I don't have a smartphone, and I don't drink. So this is what they came up with. Okay, go to a nudist beach. That doesn't mean that you're gonna have sex. Talk to people. Yes. Play beach volley. I'm not sure. Wear symbols to show that you're available. Very good. Then like relocate. So they were kind of already. It's like the access is obviously like. Go to sex parties. Yes. Start drinking. And then go to cruising areas, legit, yes, great, buy a smartphone, download Tinder, and then finally get into porn. So, I mean, there's kind of like a lot of workarounds. And yeah, it was an interesting process in terms of like seeing barriers to access to what we think of as like normative, accessible forms of contemporary sexuality, right? Okay. Sorry, I haven't done that much country music because I'm going to do like an overload of it tomorrow, so I kind of spared you, but this is my only other quote. This super sappy country song from Charlie Pride gives us a way of thinking through love in space and time. The only one locates the spatial limitations of this love object as finite, while the term ever indicates a temporal totalizing. So this is kind of what we're also kind of trying to, in the same way as diagramming history, it also applies to your own, sorry, have I gone way over time, probably? Also applying it to your own sort of like life timeline. If this is the ultimate model of romantic love that we are hegemonically taught, then what do deviations from this on a spatial or temporal level bring up for us? So I just tried to do like a little diagram. Thinking about that. 2 minutes. Yes. We're subtle. Okay, reflection. The Department of Sexual Revolution Studies did create a cross-disciplinary dialogue, getting to work with students who focus on design in areas such as sports, communication, food, and indeed sex toys. Receiving feedback from students on which elements from the programme, workshops, tutorials, whether it's country music, mapping and diagramming, longer discussions and role-playing games has given me insight on how to run programs like this. Of course, by its name alone, which is like incredibly arrogant and self-aggrandizing for something that's just me and things that I'm interested in, I hope it comes across that the nature of this project is it's not one that easily reaches completion. While I attempted to take sexuality as a road into a wide range of subjects, the sessions, of course, also represent my personal interests and what I wanted to learn and discuss. I am interested in taking the department to other institutions and other forms of the participants. The Deviant Practice programme has functioned as a launching pad for the Department of Sexual Revolution Studies. Each of these thematics that I mentioned are only addressed in as much depth as is possible within a 2-hour workshop. and within the limits of knowledge and insight that I could bring. I will try to present more further ideas on the thematic of cuckolding in the performance that I mentioned already, did I? Tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. The research on housing and sexuality will be developed further in collaboration with Ireland's Biennale EVA in a project about resource redistribution called the Intimacy Commission. A commission with Roscommon Arts Centre in Ireland will expand on the research on the transactional nature of marriage, and a project with Maya Nunes, which will develop strategies for sex education through the medium of song. Before I finish, I have to thank some more recent additions to the department staff who have helped hugely in the last couple of days and weeks putting me and the performance together for tomorrow. Maya, Hannah and Hannah, Dylan, Annabelle, Wendy, Noam, Amelie, Carly, Shane, Rosa, who's not here but at editing, the vanabbemuseum choir members, Yannicka, Fred and Jacqueline, and Jolene from the Dolly Parton song, Jolene, Wherever You Are Now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eimar.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Eimar. No, I'm going to say something whilst wait for some hands to come up. You touched on a little bit at the end, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the work with the Design Academy.
Yeah.
And some of the things that came up with the Design Academy and some of the students, and just to reflect a little bit more, I guess, on it as a kind of pedagogical and institutional process. I mean, I think what was so amazing from my point of view that you managed to kind of set up this kind of roaming department on your own. It was taken on by the Design Academy. I just wonder if you could reflect on some of the feedback that you got from the students, your sense of kind of working with them, because it was not only the sessions that you were doing here, you were also at the Design Academy.
Yeah.
So just to talk about the project a little bit from a kind of pedagogical process or experience.
Yeah. Definitely getting to, I didn't actually go into depth with this, but also it gave me the opportunity to also go to the Design Academy and work on a personal basis in tutorials with students on their own projects. For some of whom it was directly related, they were making work about for example, like a person working in sports and the relationship between gender in sports and gender divisions in sports. Other people working on, like, there was another student who was doing projects where they were using Tinder as a way of creating life drawing experiences. And getting to speak about sort of like the methods that they were using seemed to be the most important thing, because obviously, like, I don't have a design background. What I provide doesn't necessarily help in terms of outcome-based things, but I think it was a good thing to be able to talk about their processes and bear those things in mind. And also, I suppose, and there was another student who was talking about the way in which Eindhoven is branded. And the language that's used in creating a sort of Eindhoven identity, and sort of the problems, the sort of like generic nothingy taglines that can then turn into sort of nationalism, which is like, let's say, maybe not directly related to this, but that there's a way into it through these topics. But I think for most of them, it was most of the participants who were in the Design Academy, there were also participants from the public coming. It was like more adjacent to their work, and it was just of interest. It's also, I think it's also super worthwhile if any of these things are relevant as like an extracurricular life pedagogic process, if that makes sense.
I suppose the question was driven by the fact that you made a very conscious decision to do a collaboration with a academy.
Yeah.
You called it a department.
Yeah.
You kind of took on kind of structurally, but also in the form, this idea of a kind of pedagogical process. So.
Okay, I have another thing to say about that. Yes, also the way in which, something that I didn't really get to touch on here, we were highlighting the way in which designed objects and designed spaces become scripts for sexual behaviours. For behaviours generally, but specifically for sexual behaviours like double beds or domestic spaces that can fit a nuclear family, or etc. And the way in which design students have to do the work of imagining a public and their needs and anticipating it and kind of projecting onto it. Maybe I'd also kind of been a bit fascinated about like how you even take that on. Yeah, so that was probably what drew me to them. Yeah.
Any questions? Yeah.
Hello. I'm just wondering, have you read the book Sex at Dawn as part of your reading?
I haven't. Actually, an ex of mine bought it for me and then I never read it. But I
Well,
will.
it means you're not going to stay together if it was your ex. My ex also said to read it, and then I thought, oh, right.
Was it bad?
No, it basically says it questions monogamy.
Oh, yeah.
And it talks about, it was we were hunters and gatherers, and then the agricultural revolution basically, and Christianity made us become a nuclear.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what you touched on in your talk. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's anthropological as well. So
cool. Yeah. I mean, this is another, I suppose, a thing about the logo even kind of says it. It's also, I suppose, in response to the idea that what's perceived as new sexual or gender-based or relationship configurations that we think in the last sort of 5 or 10 years have only come into being now have existed, and specifically have existed pre-colonially, and their erasure and their stamping out has been part of a sort of religious imperialist and also white supremacist process.
And actually still exists in some tribal places.
Well, and still, and I think the distinction between, I think there's a danger in making kind of the distinction between like clear-cut distinctions between the sorry, what I mean is it's very useful to think about that there is a pre-existing history for this and that it has been systematically erased, and that's also why that also frames, I think, some of the backlash against it contemporarily, right? Thanks, though. I will read that book. Okay.
Any more questions? I think, in case you didn't hear, there's a lecture performance tomorrow at 8 o'clock in room 4 of the old building, which I'm really looking forward to. Eimar, thank you so much.
Thank you.